There are people in this world who make you uncomfortable just by existing. Not because they are cruel, not because they are arrogant, but because the way they live makes every excuse you have ever made about your own life suddenly visible, suddenly hollow, suddenly impossible to hold on to with the same conviction you had before you encountered them. David Goggins is one of those people. He is not famous because he was born with extraordinary gifts. He is not celebrated because life handed him favorable circumstances. He is not admired because things came easily to him. He is famous because of the exact opposite, because of what he came from, because of what he overcame, because of the sheer, almost incomprehensible volume of suffering he chose to walk through, not because he had no other option, but because he believed that on the other side of suffering was the only version of himself worth becoming. This is his story. And more than his story, this is an invitation, a challenge, a mirror held up to the part of you that knows you are capable of more than you are currently doing, and has been quietly, persistently, uncomfortably aware of that fact for a very long time. Let us begin at the beginning, because the beginning matters, because you cannot understand what David Goggins became without understanding what David Goggins survived. He was born in 1975 in Buffalo, New York. His early childhood was defined by fear. His father, Trunnis Goggins, was a violent and controlling man who ran a skating rink and forced his young son and the rest of his family to work there through the night, every night, while he spent the money they earned and subjected them to regular brutality. David watched his father beat his mother. He experienced that violence himself. He lived in a house where terror was the weather, always present, always unpredictable, always just beneath the surface of every ordinary moment. When David was 8 years old, his mother gathered the courage to escape. She took David and his brother and left in the middle of the night with almost nothing. They moved to a small town in Indiana, and what awaited them there was a different kind of suffering. Poverty so severe that in winter the pipes froze and the heat failed, and they huddled together just to stay warm. A town that was openly hostile to a black family in a predominantly white community. A school where David faced relentless racism, where teachers assumed he was incapable, where the daily experience of being made to feel worthless and unwanted was as reliable as the sunrise. He developed a stutter. He began to lose his hair from the stress. He cheated on tests to avoid the humiliation of his academic failures being exposed. He was, by any reasonable external measure, a child who had been failed by almost every system and person that should have protected and supported him. And here is what did not happen. He did not rise above it. Not yet. Not for a long time. Because trauma does not work that way. Because the story of David Goggins is not the story of a child who was hurt and immediately became extraordinary. It is the story of a man who spent years, many years, allowing what had happened to him to define what was possible for him, allowing the damage to set the ceiling. By his early 20s, David Goggins was living the consequences of that damage. He was working as an exterminator, spraying cockroaches in restaurants in the middle of the night. He weighed close to 300 pounds. He was eating himself into numbness, sugar, junk food, the cheap comfort of a body trying to insulate itself from pain it had never processed. He had no direction, no purpose, no plan. The gifts that existed within him, and they existed, they had always existed, were buried under years of hurt and habit and the quiet conviction that someone like him did not get to want more. He was 24 years old, and by every visible measure, his life was going nowhere. Then came the moment. He has described it himself, many times, with the kind of brutal honesty that is his signature. He was sitting in his apartment, eating a chocolate milkshake for breakfast, watching cockroaches scatter across the kitchen floor. The television was on, and on that television, there was a documentary about the United States Navy SEALs, the most elite special operations force in the world. The training they underwent, the standards they were held to, the men they became in the process. And something happened inside David Goggins that he could not fully explain and could not ignore. A voice, not encouraging, not gentle, but clear and cold and absolutely certain, said, "That is what you should be doing." Not, "That looks interesting." Not, "I wonder if I could do that." But, "That is what you should be doing." As a statement of identity, as a recognition of something that had been true all along, buried under the damage and the years of avoidance, and the comfortable story that he was simply not that kind of person. He called the Navy SEAL recruiter the next day. What followed was not a montage. It was not a clean, dramatic arc from lost young man to elite warrior. It was something much harder and much more instructive than that. He was told first that he needed to lose over 100 pounds in less than 3 months to meet the weight requirement for the program. 100 pounds. In 3 months. Most doctors would tell you that is not safely achievable. Most people, faced with that requirement, would hear in it a reasonable excuse to stop before they started. David Goggins heard a problem that needed to be solved. He began running. He had no running background, no fitness foundation, no athletic history to draw on. His body was not prepared for what he was asking it to do. He got stress fractures. He developed blood clots. He pushed through conditions that medical professionals would classify as grounds for immediate cessation of activity. He lost the weight. He met the requirement. He showed up for basic underwater demolition and SEAL training, BUD/S, the most grueling military training program in the United States. And he failed. He was rolled back from his first class due to pneumonia. He failed a second time. He showed up for a third class, hypothermic, exhausted, having already failed twice in a process that breaks most people once, and he completed it. He became a Navy SEAL. But here is what matters more than the achievement. Here is what makes David Goggins not just an impressive military story, but a philosophy, a way of understanding what human beings are actually capable of. At every point in that journey, the reasonable response was to stop. At every point, there was a legitimate, defensible, externally acceptable reason to say, "I tried, it didn't work, this is not for me." The weight requirement was too much. The injuries were too serious. The failures were sufficient justification for walking away. He did not walk away. Not because he was numb to the pain, not because he did not feel the cold and the exhaustion and the humiliation of failing and having to start again. He felt all of it. He has said so, clearly and repeatedly. The suffering was real. The desire to stop was real. Every morning was a negotiation with the part of him that was screaming for it to be over. He developed a tool for that negotiation. He calls it the 40% rule. The 40% rule is this: when your mind tells you that you are done, when the body is screaming and the voice in your head is saying, "Stop, this is too much, you cannot continue," you are, in reality, approximately 40% of the way through your actual capacity. 40%. The limits we feel as absolute are not our real limits. They are the limits of our comfort. The ceiling our minds construct to protect us from the discomfort of going further. And beyond that ceiling, beyond the point where everything in you is saying stop, there is 60% more. More strength, more endurance, more capability than you have ever accessed because you have never needed to, because you have always stopped when the feeling said to stop. David Goggins did not invent this idea. Exercise physiologists have studied it. Military researchers have documented it. The phenomenon of reserve capacity, the gap between what we feel we can do and what we can actually do, is real and measurable. But Goggins lived it, in conditions that make the concept visceral rather than academic. He applied this principle beyond military training. He became an ultramarathon runner, competing in races of 100 miles or more through some of the most brutal terrain in the world. He became a world record holder for the most pull-ups completed in 24 hours, completing over 4,000 after training on hands that were blistered and bleeding. He completed races while running on broken bones. He has described in detail the physical damage he has sustained in the pursuit of his limits, damage that most people would treat as a full stop, and that Goggins has treated as a comma. This is where some people dismiss him. They say, he is damaging himself. He is extreme to the point of pathology. He represents an unhealthy relationship with the body and with suffering. And it is worth sitting with that critique seriously, because it has some validity. Not everyone should do what David Goggins does. Not everyone should or needs to run 100 miles on broken bones. The specific expression of his philosophy, the volume, the intensity, the physical extremity, is not a template for every human life. But the principle beneath it is. The principle is this: you have accepted a version of yourself that is smaller than what you are capable of. You have drawn a circle around your life and called everything inside it your limit. And the circle is too small, and you know it. And the discomfort of knowing it, the quiet, persistent awareness that you are operating well below your actual capacity, is something you have learned to live with by not looking at it directly. Goggins looks directly at everything. That is his practice. That is his discipline. Not running specifically, not pull-ups specifically, but the relentless, honest, unflinching examination of every place where he is avoiding discomfort, and the deliberate choice to go toward it rather than away from it. He calls the voice in your head that tells you to stop the governor. Like the governor on an engine, the mechanism that limits the engine's output to prevent damage. The mental governor serves a similar function. It limits your output to prevent the discomfort of going further. And his life's work is the systematic dismantling of that governor. Not in one dramatic moment of decision, but day by day, workout by workout, race by race, in the thousands of small moments where the easy choice is available and he chooses the hard one anyway. He talks about something he calls the accountability mirror. Early in his transformation, he was living with so much self-delusion, so many stories he told himself about why his life was the way it was, so many excuses that felt like explanations, that he needed a way to cut through them. He started standing in front of the mirror every morning and speaking to himself with complete honesty. Not kindly, not with the gentle, compassionate self-talk that modern psychology often recommends. Brutally, he called himself out, named the lies he was telling himself, named the standards he was failing to meet, named the gap between who he said he was and who he was actually being. This sounds harsh. It is harsh, and for David Goggins, in his particular situation, with his particular psychology and his particular accumulated self-deception, it was necessary. The principle behind it, which does not require the same harshness for everyone, is the commitment to honest self-assessment. The refusal to let the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior exist unexamined. The insistence on seeing yourself clearly, even when clearly is not what you would prefer. Most people never change because they never honestly assess where they are. They are too kind to themselves, not in the genuine way of self-compassion, but in the dishonest way of avoidance. They soften the reality of their choices and their consequences until the picture that remains is comfortable enough to live with. Goggins refuses to soften anything. And there is a lesson here, not in the specific behavior, but in the underlying commitment. The commitment to truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. Especially when truth is uncomfortable. Because the truth, however hard it is to face, is the only foundation on which genuine change can be built. Comfortable lies produce comfortable stagnation. Uncomfortable truth produces movement. Now, let us talk about what Goggins represents in the broader context of human potential. Because his story is not ultimately about Navy SEALs or ultramarathons or pull-up records, it is about a question that applies to every human life. What are you actually made of? Not in the abstract, inspirational, rhetorical sense of the question, but concretely, specifically. You, with your particular history, your particular circumstances, your particular accumulated damage and untested capability, what are you actually made of? Most people never find out, because finding out requires going to the places where you are uncertain, where you might fail, where the outcome is not guaranteed, where you might be exposed to others, and worse, to yourself, as less than you hoped. Most people build their lives around avoiding those places, around staying within the range of what they already know they can do, around the safety of the familiar and the comfortable and the predictable. And the cost of that safety is never knowing what you are actually capable of, never having the experience, the particular, irreplaceable, transformative experience of discovering that you are more than you thought. David Goggins knows. He has paid for that knowledge in blood and sweat and broken bones and years of choosing hard over easy. And what he reports from the other side of all of that suffering is not that it was worth it in some calculated cost-benefit sense. What he reports is simpler and more profound than that. He knows who he is. He knows, not as a belief, not as a hope, not as a self-concept that requires external validation to feel real, but as a documented fact established through direct experience, exactly what he is capable of. And that knowledge, he says, is the most valuable thing he owns, more valuable than any title, any record, any achievement. Because when you know who you are, truly know, through tested experience rather than untested aspiration, no one can take it from you. No failure, no setback, no external circumstances can destabilize the foundation of a self that has been built through genuine trial. This is the invitation. Not to become David Goggins, not to run 100 miles or join the military or subject yourself to physical extremes that your life does not require, but to ask the question, honestly, specifically, with genuine courage, where in your life are you choosing comfort over growth? Where are you stopping at 40% and calling it your limit? Where have you drawn a circle around your capability and decided, without evidence, that the circle cannot be expanded? Because it can. Not infinitely, not without cost, not without the genuine suffering that real growth always involves, but further than you have allowed yourself to go. The 40% rule does not only apply to physical endurance, it applies to creative work. The moment when the project is hard and the temptation to stop is overwhelming and you are only 40% of the way to what it could be. It applies to relationships. The moment when the difficult conversation feels like too much and you back away from the depth that honesty would create. It applies to learning. The moment when the subject is genuinely hard and your mind is tired and you are only 40% of the way to real understanding. In every domain, the feeling of being done arrives long before you actually are. And the person who has internalized this, who has made the decision to continue past the feeling, to stay with the discomfort, to keep going when everything says stop, that person has access to a dimension of capability that most people never encounter. David Goggins earned the right to say what he says through a life of almost unimaginable difficulty and almost unimaginable effort. He is not speaking from theory. He is speaking from the deepest possible experience of what a human being can do when they refuse to accept the limits their mind constructs for them. His message, stripped of all the records and the races and the specific achievements, is this: you are not who you think you are. You are more. You have always been more. But more is on the other side of the wall of discomfort, of effort, of honest self-assessment and the choice to keep going when everything in you says to stop. Most people never go through the wall. They stop in front of it every time and call the wall their limit. It is not your limit. It is just a wall, and walls can be broken through. The only question is whether you are willing to pay the price of finding out what is on the other side. David Goggins paid it, every day, for decades. What are you willing to pay? What are you willing to become? The answer to those questions is the most important thing about you. More important than your history, more important than your circumstances, more important than anything that has happened to you, or been done to you, or said about you. Because the answer determines everything that comes next. Who are you going to be?